Well, welcome everyone. Shalom. Welcome to the services on the last day of unleavened bread. We're here on the 21st day of the first month, wrapping up the 21-day sanctification period during this first 21 days of the first month, including the 7 days of Passover and the Lord's Supper. I'd like to welcome you all. Glad you could be here, and I'd like to start services by asking James if he would please open in prayer. If you'll please stand for the opening prayer, we'll turn the mic over to James. James, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Our Father, Yehovah, we have been assembling during this 21-day period of sanctification, meaning setting ourselves apart as part of your plan of reconciliation of the whole of your creation. We'd ask you please to give us clear thoughts and strengthen our minds so we're able to hold up under all this put upon us in an attempt to fool us or disguise their war that's being brought against us. So we'd ask you and give you thanks for all that you're giving to us, and that we can be good, in fact, better examples from this 21-day period, and now at the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when the Israelites left Egypt on the morning of the Passover day, and their life was improving all the time before they entered the Promised Land, at which time the gift of this large area of land was given to the descendants of the man Israel. And the ancient Israelites were to be good examples to all who came in contact with them around them as to how to keep your law, your books of instruction as to how to live, how to protect the land, how to conduct ourselves in business affairs in every arena of our life. We come away at this time after putting ourselves under judgment for the 13 days when we were allowed to judge ourselves and not put under your son's judgment. And we all hope that we did a good job of analyzing our own thoughts and our own selves and taking corrective action after having put ourselves under judgment. So we give you thanks for your comprehension of your plan of reconciliation of the whole of planet Earth eventually. So we're honored by you to be your ambassadors to mankind and all the world, and how make it clear to them how much better life would be on this planet if they followed your ways alone, without everything that's being added by mankind. So we give you thanks for all that you have done in the past, and as this sanctification process draws to a close, as we plan on returning to our life and our homes at the time, that they would continue to protect us on this journey and traveling. And really, we ask, please, that you correct every wrong thought that we have and can take action on our own so that we have our own judgments that we put upon ourselves, and we don't have to be put under the judgments of your law. So, well, we can't thank you enough for the comprehension that we have that the prophets of old wondered about and did not have, and you've made them available to us. So we give you the greatest honor for everything that you've made, and greatest appreciation and thank you for life. I ask for this by the authority of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen to that. Thank you, James. Appreciate that as always. Thoughtful opening prayer. If you'll remain standing and take up your hymnals, open them up to page 123, all the way toward the back of the hymnal. Page 123, we'll sing our first hymn, titled Glorious Things of Thee Are Spoken. That's page 123, Glorious Things of Thee Are Spoken, to open our song service on this morning of the last day of unleavened bread. Okay, that is a good start to our service this morning. If you'll turn back a few pages to page 115, at the top of page 115 we'll sing our second hymn, titled Come Thou Almighty King. After which I would like to ask Jerry if he would please read in the book of Leviticus chapters 16 through 18. But first we'll sing the top of page 115, Come Thou Almighty King. Okay, if you'll all be seated, we'll now turn the mic over to Jerry to read in the book of Leviticus chapters 16 through 18. Jerry, over to you.
Did you hear me okay?
Yep, don't move.
I might have to turn the page. I'll be reading the Holy Scripture from the King James Version of the Bible, chapter 16. And Jehovah spoke unto Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they offered before Jehovah and died. And Jehovah said unto Moses, Speak unto Aaron, thy brother, that he come not at all times into the holy place.
Juste, je vais aller automatiquement. Il s'ajuste.
And the Lord said unto
Je sais, c'est pas grave. Laisse faire.
unto Aaron that brother, that he come not at all times in the holy place within the veil before the mercy seat, which is upon the ark, that he die not. For I will appear in a cloud upon the mercy seat. Thus shall Aaron come into the holy place with a young bullock for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat, and he shall have the linen breech upon his flesh, and it shall be girded with a linen girdle, and with a linen mitrate should it be attired. These are holy garments. Therefore shall he wash his flesh in water, and so put them on. And he shall take of the congregation of the children of Israel 2 kid of the goats for a sin offering, and 1 ram for a burnt offering. And Aaron should offer his bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself, and make an atonement for himself and for his house. And he shall take the 2 goats and present them before Jehovah at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And Aaron shall cast lots upon the 2 goats, 1 lot for Jehovah, and the other lot for the scapegoat. And Aaron shall bring the goat upon which the Jehovah's lot fell, and offer him for a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before Jehovah, to make an atonement with him, and to let him go for a scapegoat into the wilderness. And Aaron shall bring the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself, and shall make an atonement for himself and for his house, and shall kill the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself. And he shall take a censer full of burning coals of fire from off the altar before Jehovah, and his hands full of sweet incense, beating small, and bring it within the veil. And he shall put the incense upon the fire before Jehovah, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat that is upon the testimony, that he die not. And he shall take of the blood of the bullock, and sprinkle it with his finger upon the mercy seat eastward. And before the mercy seat shall he sprinkle of the blood with his finger 7 times. Then shall he kill the goat of the sin offering, that is for the people, and bring his blood within the veil, and do with that blood as he did with the blood of the bullock, and sprinkle it upon the mercy seat, and before the mercy seat. And he shall make an atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanliness of the children of Israel, and because of their transgressions and all their sins. And so shall he do for the tabernacle of the congregation, that remaineth among them in the midst of their uncleanliness. And there shall be no man in the tabernacle of the congregation when he goeth in to make an atonement in the holy place, until he come out and had made an atonement for himself and for his household and for all the congregation of Israel. And he shall go out unto the altar that is before Jehovah, and make an atonement for it, and shall take of the blood of the bullock and of the blood of the goat, and put it upon the horns of the altar round about. And he shall sprinkle of the blood upon it with his fingers 7 times, and cleanse it, and hallow it from the uncleanliness of the children of Israel. When he had made an end of reconciling the holy place in the tabernacle of the congregation in the altar, he shall bring the live goat. And Aaron shall lay both his hands upon the head of the live goat, and confess over him all the iniquities of the children of Israel, and all their transgressions and all their sins, putting them upon the head of the goat, and shall send them away by the hand of a fit man into the wilderness. And the goat shall bear witness upon him all their iniquities unto a land not inhabited, and he shall let go the goat in the wilderness. And Aaron shall come into the tabernacle of the congregation, and shall put off the linen garments which he put on when he went into the holy place, and shall leave them there. And he shall wash his flesh with water in the holy place, and put on his garments, and come forth and offer his burnt offering and the burnt offering of the people, and make an atonement for himself and for the people. And the fat of the sin offering shall be burnt upon the altar. And he that let go of the goat for the scapegoat shall wash his clothes, and bathe his flesh in water, and afterwards come into the camp. And the bullock for the sin offering, and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought in to make an atonement in the holy place, shall one carry forth without the camp, and they shall burn it in the fire their skins, and their flesh in their dung. And he that burneth them shall wash his clothes, and bathe his flesh in water, and afterwards he shall come into the camp. And this shall be a statute forever unto you, that in the 7th month, on the 10th day, you shall afflict your souls, and do no work at all, whether it be one of your own country, or a stranger that sojourn among you. For on that day shall the priest make an atonement for you, to cleanse you, that you may be clean from all your sins before Jehovah. It shall be a Sabbath of rest unto you, and you shall afflict your souls by a statute forever. And the priest whom he shall anoint, and whom he shall consecrate to minister in the priest's office, in his father's stead, shall make the atonement, and shall put on the linen clothes, even the holy garments. And he shall make an atonement for the holy sanctuary. He shall make an atonement for the tabernacle of the congregation, and for the altar he shall make an atonement for the priest and for all the people of the congregation. And this shall be an everlasting statute unto you, to make an atonement for the children of Israel for all their sins once a year. And he did as Jehovah commanded Moses. Chapter 17. And Jehovah spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron and unto his sons and all the children in Israel, and say unto them, This is the thing which Jehovah has commanded, saying, What man soever there be of the house of Israel that killeth an ox or lamb or goat in the camp, or that kill it out of the camp, and bring it not unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, to offer an offering unto Jehovah before the tabernacle of Jehovah, blood shall be imputed on that man. He hath shedded blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people. To the end that the children of Israel may bring their sacrifices, which they offer in the open field, even that they bring them unto Jehovah, unto the doors of the tabernacle of the congregation, unto the priests, and offer them for a peace offering unto Jehovah. And the priest shall sprinkle the blood upon the altar of Jehovah, at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and burn the fat for a sweet savor unto Jehovah. And they shall no more offer their sacrifices unto devils, after whom they have gone of whoring. This shall be a statute forever unto them through all their generations. When thou shalt say unto them, Whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel, or of strangers which sojourn among you, that offer a burnt offering or sacrifice, and bring it not unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, to offer it unto Jehovah, even that man shall be cut off from among his people. And whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among you, that eateth any manner of blood, I will even set my face against that soul that eateth blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I give it unto you upon the altar to make an atonement for your soul, for it is the blood that make an atonement for the soul. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, No soul of you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger that sojourn among you eat blood. And whatsoever man there be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among you, which hunteth and catcheth any beast or fowl that may be eaten, He shall even pour out the blood thereof and cover with dust. For it is the life of all flesh. The blood of it is for the life thereof. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, you shall eat the blood of no manner of flesh, for the life of all flesh is the blood thereof. Whosoever eateth it shall be cut off. And every soul that eateth it, that which die of itself, which was torn with beasts, whether it be one of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the eve. Then shall he be clean. But if he washes them not, nor bathe his flesh, then he shall bear his iniquity. Chapter 18. And Jehovah spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am Jehovah your God. After the doing of the land of Egypt, wherein you dwelled, you shall not do. And after the doing of the land of Canaan, which whether I bring you, shall you not do. Neither shall you walk in their ordinances. You shall do my judgments and keep my ordinances to walk therein. I am Jehovah your God. And you shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man doeth, he shall live in them. I am Jehovah. None of you shall approach to any that is nearer of kin to him, to uncover their nakedness. I am Jehovah. The nakedness of your father, or the nakedness of thy mother, shall thou not uncover. She is thy mother, thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's wife shalt thou not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness. The nakedness of thy sister, the daughter of thy father, or the daughter of thy mother, whether she be born at home or born abroad, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover. The nakedness of thy son's daughter, or of thy daughter's daughter, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover, for theirs is thy own nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's daughter, begotten of thy father, she is thy sister, thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's sister, she is thy father's near kinswoman. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy mother's sister, for she is thy mother's near kinswoman. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's brother. Thou shalt not approach to his wife, she is thy aunt. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy daughter-in-law. She is thy son's wife. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It is thy brother's nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter. Neither shalt thou take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness, for they are her near kinswoman. It is wickedness. Neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister to vex her, to uncover her nakedness, besides the other in her lifetime. Also thou shalt not approach unto a woman to uncover her nakedness, as long as she is put apart for her uncleanliness. Moreover, thou shalt not lie carnally with thy neighbor's wife, to defile thyself with her. And thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech. Neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am Jehovah. Thou shalt not lie with any mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. Neither thou shalt lie thyself with any beast to defile thyself therein. Neither shall any woman stand before a beast to lie down thereto. It is confusion. Defile not yourself in any of these things, for in all of these things in the nation are defiled, which I cast out before you. And the land is defiled. Therefore I do visit the iniquity thereupon it, and the land itself vomit out her inhabitants. Thou shalt therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, or any stranger that sojourns among you. For all of these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. The land spewed not you out also when you defile it, as it spewed out the other nations that were before you. For whatsoever shall commit any of these abominations, even the souls that commit them shall be cut off from among their people. Therefore you shall keep my ordinances that you commit not any one of these abominable customs which were committed before you, that you defile not yourself therein. I am Jehovah your God. That's the end of today's holy reading of Holy Scripture.
Well, thank you, Jerry. Seems pretty straightforward to me. You know, there are a lot of things that people pick and choose as to what they want to observe out of Scripture, but we know that that's not our place to pick and choose. All of it applies to us, and we have to obey every word. Our Creator gave us rules to live by, and those rules are designed to provide us with peace and happiness. And we've obviously chosen not to observe that, so here we are. Okay, if you'll please stand and open your hymnals to page 110, we'll sing our third hymn titled, Yah, Teach Me That I May Know, and this hymn comes from Psalm 143. That's page 110, Yah, Teach Me That I May Know, after which I'll be back with the main message, which is part 2 of our study on Passover and the gods of Egypt. So page 110, Yah, Teach Me That I May Know. Okay, if you'll all be seated, we'll now have our main message, which, as I said, is a continuation of our study on Passover and the gods of Egypt. We covered the first 5 plagues in in part 1 of the study. So we'll pick it up now with the 6th plague, which is the plague of boils. And you can find that in Exodus 9, 8 through 12, which says, And Yehovah said to Moses and Aaron, Take handfuls of soot.
Ça, c'est mon micro qui ferme.
Ok. Peux cliquer dessus. Là, tu peux.
Take handfuls, sorry about that. Take handfuls of silt. Take handfuls of soot from the kiln and let Moses throw them in the air in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become fine dust over all the land of Egypt and become boils breaking out in sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt. So they took soot from the kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air, and it became boils breaking out in sores on man and beast. and the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. For the boils came upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. But Jehovah hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them, as Jehovah had spoken to Moses. Right, so here we have Jehovah hardening the heart of Pharaoh. In the previous plagues, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, and now Jehovah is hardening his heart. And this plague was not really formally announced, and it hit the Egyptians with a vengeance. And there's really, as far as I can tell, no logical link between the ash being thrown toward the heavens and the falling dust that brings the infection. In all likelihood, Moses and Aaron had carried a bucket or other container of the soot with them when they stood before Pharaoh and threw it up in the air. Now, these boils that break out in sores are later described as a disease that is accompanied with tumors, with the scab and with the itch, from Deuteronomy 28:27. Now, this could very well have been skin anthrax, as it's called, which is a black abscess that develops into a pustule that was introduced by the bites from the flies who had been feeding on the dead frogs and cattle. Now, at this time, there were painful boils which affected the knees, legs, and soles of the feet, according to Deuteronomy 28:27 and 35. And this kind of gives us some insight and helps us understand why Pharaoh's magicians couldn't stand before Moses because of the boils. For the boils were on the magicians and on all the Egyptians. And you can see that in Exodus 9:11. And this is the last time the magicians of Pharaoh are mentioned in Exodus. If the magicians and physicians couldn't cure themselves, then what good would they possibly be to Pharaoh, right? They had no power to cure themselves because this was a supernatural event. So what gods were affected by this plague, or what gods were being judged by this plague? This plague was a direct affront to Imhotep, the god of medicine. And this alone must have led to great despair in the land, since he was worshipped all over the country. Imhotep was vizier to the third dynasty pharaoh Zoser, circa 2600 BC. He later became a demigod, then finally evolved into a full Egyptian deity. So he was actually a man at one point. His name means the one who comes in peace, and it's very likely that he was the architect who planned Egypt's first large-scale stone monument, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. Now, Imhotep was later worshipped as a god of medicine, but magic and medicine were hard to distinguish in ancient Egypt. They kind of went hand in hand. According to Durant in Our Oriental Heritage on page 147, where he says the first real person in known history is not a conqueror or a king, but an artist and a scientist. Imhotep, physician, architect, and chief advisor to King Zoser. He did so much for Egyptian medicine that later generations worshipped him as a god of knowledge, author of their sciences and their arts, and at the same time he appears to have founded the school of architecture which provided the next dynasty with the first great builders in history. And in Ancient Egyptian Gods and Goddesses on page 47, Hart says, Imhotep was worshipped as a god at Saqqara, Thebes, and in the temple of Isis on the island of Philae. He acquired a reputation as a god of healing, and early Greek visitors to Egypt identified him with their own god of medicine, Asclepios. And then in Egyptian Medicine in the Days of the Pharaohs, page 138, Ebaid says, the Edwin Smith papyrus was so admirable in content that its editor attributed it to Imhotep himself and described it as the oldest treatise on surgery in the world. So you can see how this would have been a direct judgment against this God of healing, God of medicine, God of knowledge. So it's not hard to see that. This plague was also an affront to the god Thoth. This god was an ibis-headed god of intelligence and medical learning. Thoth was symbolized to the ancient Egyptians by the ibis, and at other times by the baboon. He was also very important in the underworld, where in the court of justice he recorded the weight of the heart on the justice scale. In Ebaid's work, Egyptian Medicine in the Days of Pharaohs, page 368, he says, he was the great scribe and was the God to whom the scribes prayed. He had revealed to man the art of writing. He was the God of figures, of calculations and reckoning of time. He was patron of physicians and magicians. He was inventor of hieroglyphic writing, and he was the Lord of wisdom and magic. So quite a guy. Thoth represented to the Egyptians the embodiment of all scientific literary attainments, being in command of all the sacred books in the House of Life. And this is coming from Egyptian Gods and Goddesses, page 216, where Hart also goes on to say the House of Life, or Per Ankh, was a revered resource center accessible only to scribes, containing a wealth of knowledge on papyri, all under the protection of Thoth. For example, medical manuals, mathematical problems, and instructional documents on social etiquette. So Thoth was given all these attributes and worshipped as such, and God is therefore proving that he's not all that. Now Isis, who is the goddess of love, magic, and medicine, and was the most popular goddess in ancient Egypt, this was a direct affront to her attributes as well. In Hart's work, Ancient Egyptian Gods and Goddesses, on page 25, it says, the pharaoh identifies with Horus, so Isis is symbolically his divine mother. Isis had to use magic to protect Horus against dangers when he was a child. So she was invoked by Egyptian women when their own children were sick with fevers or bitten by poisonous animals. Now, the largest temple of Isis, it was at Philae Island. Now Sekhmet, who was a lioness-headed god of epidemics and healing, was also being addressed here, or so it appears. In Wilkinson's The Complete Gods and Goddesses of Ancient Egypt, on page 181, he says the goddess also had power to ward off pestilence, and she could function as a healing deity, even being called Sekhmet, Mistress of Life. And in Hart's work, Ancient Egyptian Gods and Goddesses, on page 15, he says, because Sekhmet was so fierce, the Egyptians thought that she might be able to fight off plagues and cure diseases for which doctors had no remedies. So you can see how the Egyptians must have been exasperated, because they believed in these deities and their power, yet even their doctors and their magicians and priests were all suffering from these same maladies that were brought on by God. Sekhmet's priests are repeatedly mentioned in Egyptian writings as healers along with magicians and physicians. The main center of Sekhmet worship was at Memphis. And the first 6 plagues followed a natural progression of events in connection with the inundation of the Nile and receding waters a few weeks later. And now, right, I mean, at first it was a minor inconvenience, but now, you know, they are being severely afflicted and their livestock along with them. So the first 6 plagues against the land of Egypt followed a natural progression connected with annual summer inundation of the Nile, as we said, and its subsequent receding. So a lot of these things would happen naturally. Obviously, these were supernaturally invoked by God. And beginning with the 4th plague, God made a distinction between his people and the Egyptians. So the first 3, well, the people of Israel had to endure as well. And these plagues are getting progressively worse as they go. As I said, they went from being kind of an inconvenience to diseases that afflicted the body and were very painful and nasty. So the next series of plagues would not only affect the livelihood of the Egyptians, but their very ability to sustain themselves in the land. In Hoffmeyer's Israel and Egypt, page 147, he says, the first 6 plagues form a natural sequence of interdependent events resulting from a high Nile infected by flagellates, whereas plagues 7 through 10 were not connected to the first 6. Hail, thunder, and lightning, the 7th plague, not only caused damage to crops, but was a source of terror to the Egyptians, since hail is uncommon in Egypt. Violent rainstorms do strike Egypt from time to time, with several devastating examples occurring in recent years. So, moving on to the 7th plague, which is hail. And we can pick that up in Exodus 9:13 through 35, where it says, Then Yehovah said to Moses, Rise up early in the morning and present yourself before Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says Yehovah, the Elohim of the Hebrews, Let my people go, that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you yourself, and on your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose I have raised you up. Right? So here God is identifying the whole reason he raised Pharaoh up. And that is to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. So, you know, Pharaoh was kind of worshipped as a god figure. And God is demonstrating his power over not only Pharaoh, but all of the gods that the Egyptians worshipped. Continuing in verse 17, You are still exalting yourself against my people and will not let them go. Behold, about this time tomorrow I will cause very heavy hail to fall, such as never has been in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Now therefore send, get your livestock and all that you have in the field into safe shelter. For every man and beast that is in the field and is not brought home will die when the hail falls on them. Then whoever feared the word of Yehovah among the servants of Pharaoh hurried his slaves and his livestock into the houses. But whoever did not pay attention to the word of Yehovah left his slaves and his livestock in the field. Then Yehovah said to Moses, Stretch out your hand toward heaven, so that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt, on man and on beast and every plant of the field in the land of Egypt. Then Moses stretched out his staff toward heaven, and Yehovah sent thunder and hail, and fire ran down to the earth. Fire ran down to the earth, and Yehovah rained hail upon the land of Egypt. There was hail and fire flashing continually in the midst of the hail. very heavy hail, such as had never been in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. The hail struck down everything that was in the field in all the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and the hail struck down every plant of the field and broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel were, was there no hail. Then Pharaoh sent and called Moses and Aaron and said to them, "This time I have sinned. Yehovah is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong." Wow, that's quite an admission. Verse 28, "Plead with Yehovah, for there has been enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer." Moses said to him, "As soon as I have gone out of the city, I will stretch out my hands to Yehovah. The thunder will cease, and there will be no more hail, so that you may know that the earth is Yehovah's." You see, the entire earth belongs to God. It doesn't belong to anyone else. We use it, and we have a right to use it by claim, but it still belongs to God. Verse 30, "But as for you and your servants, I know that you do not yet fear Yehovah Elohim." The flax and the barley were struck down, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in bud. Right? So that gives us an indication as to the time of year, which is around Passover time. But the wheat and the emmer were not struck down, for they are late in coming up. So Moses went out of the city from Pharaoh and stretched out his hands to Yehovah, and the thunder and the hail ceased, and the rain no longer poured upon the earth. But when Pharaoh saw the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned yet again and hardened his heart, he and his servants. So the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go, just as Yehovah had spoken through Moses. So this plague is actually described in more detail than any of the other first plagues. And it's the only time where God explains to Pharaoh the purpose of the plagues, right? He gives him that reason, so that his name may be proclaimed through all the earth. And Pharaoh needed to learn about the uniqueness of Yehovah in order to understand his power, right? And the region around Cairo normally receives around 2 inches of rain per year, but sudden destructive storms can sometimes hit the land, and they do from time to time. But in this plague, God sent the worst hailstorm in Egyptian history, right? It says no other storm like it. So this plague is really the first time that God offers the Egyptians a way to escape the consequences of the plague. He says, listen to me and bring those animals into safe shelter. And those that listened brought them in, and those that didn't left them in the field, and they paid the price. Now, barley and flax are among the first crops planted and harvested after annual inundation of the Nile. And the flax and barley crops were destroyed, according to Exodus 9:31, which means this had to have taken place in early part of the year, getting close to this time of the year in the spring. Flax was very important to the Egyptians, for they used it to make linen. Now, wheat was a crop that not only fed the people, but was used for export. And although the plague caused widespread devastation, a few of the trees remained for locusts, which would be coming in the next plague. Right? So God tears them down bit by bit. So, which gods were being addressed in this plague? we see that in each of these plagues there are gods that could very well have been the exact target. Now this plague originated from the sky, which is the realm of Nut, the sky goddess. According to Spence in Ancient Egyptian Myths and Legends on page 173, he says, her most general appearance, however, is that of a woman resting on hands and feet, her body forming an arch, thus representing the sky. Her limbs typified the four pillars on which the sky was supposed to rest. She was supposed to originally be reclining on Geb, which is the earth, when Shu raised her from this position. Now Nut was the mother of 5 gods, Osiris, Hathor, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. So where was Shu, the god of sunlight and air, during this plague? Where are Horus, the falcon-headed sky god of Upper Egypt and symbol of divine kingship? Horus first appears in Egyptian hieroglyphs at around 3000 BC and was believed to be the child of Isis. Where was Tefnet, the primeval goddess of water, rain, dew, and moisture? Where was Renenutet, the cobra goddess of grain and the harvest and the guardian of Pharaoh, right? Where were all these gods, and why weren't they protecting the Egyptians? In his work, The Gods and Goddesses of Ancient Egypt, Hussein, on page 121, says, she was the goddess of harvest and the mother, Nibri, the god of the wheat and the crops. She was worshipped at Fayum. She was pictured in the form of a snake or a woman with the head of a snake. She was usually combined with the goddess Renenet. That was normal since the crops represented man's fortune and good destiny in life. And in Wilkinson's work, The Complete Gods and Goddesses of Ancient Egypt, on page 226, it says, while amulets depicting the goddess show she may have functioned as a protective deity, it was a goddess of fecundity that Renetet was most widely venerated, and the goddess was popular among agricultural workers especially. The festivals of Renetet were celebrated in the last month of the season when crops were sown, and in the following month, the first month of the summer season, when they began to ripen. Now, she was often represented as a woman or a female with a cobra head suckling a child. And Min, M-I-N, one of Egypt's most ancient gods, the god of reproduction and the creator of all things. Where was he? His major festival, the coming forth of Min, was celebrated at the beginning of the harvest season. This festival was among the most important religious and agricultural festivals in Egypt. None of these gods came to answer. In Kaiser's A History of Israel on page 99, he says, the 7th and 8th plagues, hail and locusts, were opposed to Seth, who manifested himself in wind and storms, or against Isis, goddess of life, or even against Min, who was worshipped as a god of fertility. Min is an especially good candidate for these 2 plagues, for he was widely revered in a coming out of Min celebration at the beginning of harvest. And as occurred in the 4th and 5th plagues, the Israelites in the land of Goshen didn't suffer. They didn't suffer this plague as God set them apart. And you can see that in Exodus 9:26. In the work Exodus, an introduction and commentary on page 105, Cole says, if the thunderstorm was moving up the funnel of the narrow Nile Valley with hot desert and hills on either side, it's understandable that an area to the east escaped damage, where the air currents would be completely different. If so, Israel rightly saw in this not a geographical peculiarity, but the very hand of God delivering his people. A little tongue twisted. Pharaoh still wouldn't let the Israelites go. He hardened his heart. Notice it says he hardened his heart. It doesn't say God hardened his heart. Now we move into the 8th plague, which is locusts. So in Exodus 10, verses 1 through 20, we can find that, where it says, Then Jehovah said to Moses, Go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am Jehovah. So Moses and Aaron went in to Pharaoh and said to him, Thus says Jehovah, the Elohim of the Hebrews, How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow I will bring locusts into your country, and they shall cover the face of the land, so that no one can see the land. And they shall eat what is left to you after the hail, and they shall eat every tree of yours that grows in the field, and they shall fill your houses, and the houses of all your servants, and all the Egyptians, as neither your fathers nor your grandfathers have seen, from the day they came on earth to this day. Then he turned and went out from Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh's servants said to him, How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve Jehovah their Elohim. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined? Right? So even his servants are trying to get him to let him go. Verse 8, So Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh, and he said to them, Go, serve Jehovah your Elohim. But which ones are to go? Moses said, We will go with our young and our old. We will go with our sons and daughters and with our flocks and herds, for we must hold a feast to Jehovah. And he said to them, Jehovah be with you, if ever I let you and your little ones go. Look, you have some evil purpose in mind. No, go, the men among you, and serve Jehovah, for that is what you are asking. And they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. Then Jehovah said to Moses, Stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt for the locusts, so that they may come upon the land of Egypt and eat every plant in the land, all that the hail is left. So Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt, and Jehovah brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. When it was morning, the east wind had brought the locusts. The locusts came up over the land of Egypt and settled on the whole country of Egypt. Such a dense swarm of locusts as had never been before, nor ever will be again. They covered the face of the whole land, so that the land was darkened, and they ate all the plants in the land, and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Not a green thing remained, neither tree nor plant of the field, through all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh hastily called Moses and Aaron and said, I have sinned against Jehovah your Elohim and against you. Now therefore forgive my sin, please, only this once, and plead with Jehovah your Elohim, only to remove this death from me. So he went out from Pharaoh and pleaded with Jehovah, and Jehovah turned the wind into a very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea. Not a single locust was left in the country of Egypt. But Jehovah hardened Pharaoh's heart, and did not let the and he did not let the people of Israel go. So now again we see Jehovah hardening his heart. Now, these locust swarms in Near East times could destroy entire villages' food supplies in a matter of minutes, right? These things are pretty devastating. And these locusts were coming in to finish off the last remaining vegetation after the plague of the hail. And locusts are often described as armies. We see that in Joel 1:6-7 and 2:25. And in the Old Testament age, locusts were often seen as a symbol of divine judgment, right? God used them to punish people or to correct their behavior, to demonstrate his power. In Martin's work, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, on page 46, he says, "The Lord brought an east wind, a usual carrier of locusts that rely on such winds, if they are to travel very far. With the wind came swarms of devouring locusts that settled in all regions of the country in vast numbers. The locusts, in the Hebrew arbe, were 2 inches or more in length and had 4 wings. Although they had 6 legs, they walked on 4, using the back legs for springing." And in Walton Matthews and Chavalas's work, the IVP Bible Background Commentary, Old Testament, on pages 83 and 84, they say, "Locusts were all too common in the ancient Near East and were notorious for the devastation and havoc they brought. The locusts breed in the region of the Sudan and would have been more plentiful than usual in the wet climate that initiated the entire sequence. Their migration would strike in February or March and would follow the prevailing winds to either Egypt or Palestine. The east wind, in verse 13, would bring them into Egypt. A locust will consume its own weight each day. Locust swarms have been known to cover as many as 400 square miles, and even 1 square mile could teem with over 100 million insects." That's a lot. "Certainly anything that had survived the hail was now destroyed, and if they laid their eggs before being blown out to sea, the problem would recur in cycles." And then in Davis's work, Moses and the Gods of Egypt, on pages 128 and 129, he says, "No one who has ever seen the locusts at work accuses the Bible account of hyperbole. In 1926 and 27, small swarms of the African migratory locusts were spotted in an area 50 by 120 miles on the plains of the river Niger, near Timbuktu. The next year, swarms invaded Senegal and Sierra Leone. By 1930, the whole of West Africa was flailing away at the pests with everything movable, but the locusts didn't seem to notice. Swarms reached Khartoum, more than 2,000 miles to the east of Timbuktu, then turned south, spreading across Ethiopia, Kenya, the Belgian Congo, and in 1932 striking into the lush farmland of Angola and Rhodesia. Before the plague finally sputtered out 14 years after it began, it affected 5 million miles of Africa, an area nearly double the size of the United States." That's pretty serious. And in Whiting's article titled "Jerusalem's Locust Plague" in the National Geographic magazine, he says, "About our houses they became so thick that one could not help crushing them with every step. They even fell into one's shirt collar from the walls above and crawled up onto one's person. Women were especially troubled with them, and on one occasion a lady, after being away from home for half a day, returned with 110 of them concealed within her skirts. Whenever touched, or especially when finding themselves caught within one's clothes, they exuded from their mouth a dark fluid, an irritant to the skin and soiling the garments in a most disgusting manner. Imagine the feeling, we speak from experience, with a dozen or 2 such creatures over an inch long, with saw-like legs and rough bodies, making a race course on your back." So yeah, it's pretty disgusting. So the servants in Pharaoh's house, as I said, they were afraid, dreadfully afraid. And Pharaoh finally asked Moses to take this death away from him. And we saw that in 10:17. Exodus 10, verse 17. So which gods were being addressed here? Because so far, these useless gods hadn't been able to do anything. There was zero response. So Nepri, or Naper, was the god of grain, but yet no response from him. According to Wilkinson, in the Complete Gods and Goddesses of Ancient Egypt on page 117, he says the god Naper was a grain deity whose agricultural origin was an early one and who may well have predated the aspect of Osiris. The hieroglyphic writing of Naper's name includes the symbol of grain, and in a procession of deities carved in the reign of the 5th dynasty, King Sehur, the body of the god is dotted to symbolize the grain which Naper represented. Because the harvest was so dependent upon the yearly flooding of the Nile, the inundation deity Hapi was said to be Lord of Naper, but the god was honored in his own right as an important deity of the harvest and prosperity. Naper was often associated with the cobra goddess Renutet, who also was a patron of the harvest. And because Naper was dependent on the flooding of the Nile to bring down the silt and that all the nutrients to the crops, he is a subordinate deity to Hapi, who, as we just read, was described as the Lord of Naper. And so Renenutet, the cobra goddess of grain, Isis, Seth, the god of crops, was also silent. These gods were nothing. And this is what God was trying to demonstrate. He was demonstrating the fact that he alone is God, and none of these false idols that man devises to worship and consume his time are of any benefit and cannot save. Okay, moving on to the 9th plague of darkness. We see that in Exodus 10, 21 through 29. Exodus 10, 21 through 29 says, Then Yehovah said to Moses, Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. But all the people of Israel had light where they lived. Then Pharaoh called Moses and said, Go serve Yehovah, your little ones also may go with you. Only let your flocks and your herds remain behind. Right? So he's still stubborn and won't do what he was told. But Moses said, You must also let us have sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice to Yehovah our Elohim. Our livestock also must go with us. Not a hoof shall be left behind, for we must take of them to serve Yehovah our Elohim, and we do not know with what we must serve Yehovah until we arrive there. But Yehovah hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. Right? So Pharaoh is starting to weaken, and we can see that God is starting to harden his heart now. He would not let them go. Verse 28, Then Pharaoh said to him, Get away from me. Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die. Moses said, As you say, I will not see your face again. Now, this 9th plague doesn't appear to have any kind of warning to Pharaoh. You know, God told Moses what was going to happen, but nobody told Pharaoh. And it completely immobilized the land of Egypt for 3 days. This number 3 is interesting. It's divine completion. If you think about it, you know, if you think about the world's leaders today and how they would react under these circumstances, the pride and arrogance of people really drives them to do ridiculous things. In Hoffmeyer's work, Israel in Egypt, page 148, he says the final plague in the third series, 3 days of darkness, from Exodus 10:21 through 23, has long been associated with desert sandstorms, khamsines, common to Egypt in March. The minute particles of sand transported by these khamsines, coupled with the extreme heat, make these desert storms most uncomfortable. I can attest to the discomfort of this phenomenon. In 1967, I traveled by train from Minya to Cairo, about 275 kilometers or 170 miles, and throughout this trip, the Nile Valley was blanketed by a brownish cloud that literally could be felt. A point noted in Exodus 10:2. In the mid-afternoon hours, cars drove with lights on. Again, in March of 1995, a khamsin covered Egypt from south of Luxor to north of Cairo throughout the day, grounding planes. Finally, at 11 p.m., our plane could depart Luxor from Cairo. Khamsins can last up to 2 or 3 days. And in Walton, Matthews, and Chavalis' work, the IBP Bible Background Commentary, Old Testament, on page 84, it says the comment that it was darkness that could be felt, from verse 21, suggests that the darkness was caused by something airborne, namely the khamsin, dust storms known in the region. There would be excessive dust from all of the red earth that had been brought down and deposited by the Nile, as well as from the barren earth left behind in the wake of the hail and the locusts. The 3-day duration is typical for this type of storm, which is most likely to occur between March and May. The fact that the text emphasizes the darkness rather than the dust storm may indicate that the sun god Amun-Ra, the national god of Egypt, the divine father of Pharaoh, is being specifically targeted. And in the Jewish Study Bible, it says, since the darkness can be touched, it may reflect the Hamsin, the hot southerly wind from the Sahara Desert, carrying unusually dense concentrations of sand and dust that block out sunlight. Now, it seems like after the damage caused by the hail and the locust, that the ground would have been left bare, right? There was nothing left. And so there would have been more sand and soil that could have been picked up by these storms. That, is logical. In Edersheim's The Bible History, Old Testament, he says it was literally, as Scripture has it, a darkness which might be felt. The darkness of a great sandstorm such as the Khamsin or southwest wind sometimes brings in early spring, only far more severe, intense, and long. Let us try to realize the scene. Suddenly and without warning would the Khamsin rise. The air, charged with electricity, draws up the fine dust and the coarser particles of sand till the light of the sun is hid. The heavens are covered as with a thick veil, and darkness deepens into such night that even artificial light is of no avail. And the floating dust and sand enter every apartment, pervade every pore, find their way even through closed windows and doors. Men and beasts make for every kind of shelter, seek refuge in cellars and out-of-the-way places from the terrible plague. And so, in utter darkness and suffering, 3 weary nights and long days pass, no one venturing to stir from his hiding. All right, so even artificial light, right, wouldn't do any good in a case like that. And in Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, he says, but when Moses said that what he desired was unjust, since they were obliged to offer sacrifices to God of those cattle, and the time being prolonged on this account, a thick darkness without the least light spread itself over the Egyptians, whereby their sight being obstructed and their breathing hindered by the thickness of the air, they died miserably and under a terror lest they should be allowed up by the dark cloud. So which gods were being addressed here. In Wells's work on Exodus, or in the work Exodus, Wells comments, from the perspective of the Egyptians, the absence of sunlight had profound meaning. They believed that the regular circling of the sun god in the sky meant his blessing on Egypt. An interruption in that cycle spelled disaster. Thus, this text seems to be targeting the sun god, probably the most venerated deity in Egypt. But which Egyptian god does the biblical text have in mind? Throughout Egyptian history, the sun was worshipped as a manifestation of various deities such as Atum, Ra, Amun, and Amun-Ra. Pharaoh too was associated with the sun. Despite this ambiguity, the narrative of Exodus is once again claiming utter powerlessness for the king and the gods of Egypt. Moreover, darkness frequently turns up in biblical text as a symbol of judgment. You can see that in Isaiah 8:22, Joel 2:2, and Zephaniah 1:15. And in Walton's Archaeological Study Bible, it says the plague of darkness was almost certainly a challenge against Ra, an Egyptian sun god. This would have been a direct challenge to Pharaoh, since Egyptian kings were referred to as sons of Ra. Now, the sun god Amun, or Amun-Ra, was considered one of the greatest blessings and the most powerful god in all the land of Egypt, right? And Amun and Ra were originally two separate gods, Ra being the sun god, whose cult was at Heliopolis, or On, the temple of On, and the main center of solar worship. And remember that Joseph married Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, who was a priest of On. In Wilkinson's The Complete Gods and Goddesses of Ancient Egypt, he says, according to the cosmogonic ideas developed in Heliopolis and at other sites, the sun god Ra was the supreme creator who emerged from the primeval waters at the beginning of time to create every aspect of the world. And in Hart's Egyptian Gods and Goddesses on page 179, he says his main cult center was at Heliopolis, Greek for Sun City, now all but disappeared through depredations or below the suburbs of modern Cairo. The Sun Temple area was called Yunu by the ancient Egyptians, or On in biblical literature, and was written by a hieroglyph representing a column clearly the ancient cult image on the site. And in Kidner's Genesis and Introduction and Commentary on page 209, he says Asenath and Potipharah are recognizably Egyptian names, meaning respectively she belongs, or may she belong, to Neith, a goddess, and he whom Ra has given. Ra was the sun god worshipped at On, a city which the Greeks later called Heliopolis, city of the sun. So Ra is represented in art with a man's body and a falcon's head, surmounted by a solar disk, and was believed to sail across the sky in a boat each day and under the world at night. In Durant's Our Oriental Heritage on page 198 says the moon was a god, perhaps the oldest of all that were worshipped in Egypt. But in the official theology, the greatest of the gods was the sun. Sometimes it was worshipped as the supreme deity Ra, or Re, the bright father who fertilized Mother Earth with rays of penetrating heat and light. Sometimes it was a divine calf, which, happened at the base of the mountain. So sometimes it was a divine calf, born anew at every dawn, sailing the sky slowly in a celestial boat and descending into the west at evening. like an old man tottering to his grave, or the sun was the god Horus, right? So it was also the god Horus, taking the graceful form of a falcon, flying majestically across the heavens day after day, as if in supervision of his realm, and becoming one of the recurrent symbols of Egyptian religion and royalty. Always Ra, or the sun, was the creator. At his first rising, seeing the earth desert and bare, he had flooded it with energizing rays, and all living things, vegetable, animal, and human, had sprung pell-mell from his eyes and been scattered over the world. So they worshipped him as a creator and sustainer. So continuing on here. So where were these gods? Where was Horus, right? He was the god of light who personified the life-giving power of the sun. Where was he? He was usually represented as a falcon-headed man wearing a sun disk as a crown, as I said, and the reigning kings of Egypt were believed to be incarnations of Horus. There's Ptah, who was the chief god of Memphis, the one who created the moon, the sun, and the earth. He was nowhere to be found. Atum, the sun god and creator, who was also worshipped at Heliopolis, the major center of sun worship. He wasn't there. There was Aten, the solar and creator god of Egypt. He's often depicted as with a solar disk whose rays end in his hands during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten from 1352 to 1336 BC. Aten became the supreme god of the Egyptian pantheon. There's Shu, who was the god of sunlight and air. Where was he? None of these gods had any impact. Of course, we know that, right? But to these people, it had to be quite astonishing what was occurring. And even the servants of Pharaoh were saying, hey, this is pretty serious. You better straighten up. And, these plagues are getting worse and worse and worse. And it's against the people and the livestock and their crops. And this is causing enormous financial loss and an inability to sustain themselves. And, their bodies were being afflicted in the sixth plague. The destruction of the crops not only struck their financial capability, but their food source. And so this ninth plague, it brought fear and terror because the gods of the sky were brought to nothing, and these Egyptians, they worshiped these gods as sustainers of life. But Pharaoh still refused to let them go. He's still not letting the Israelites go. And so now comes the final plague. And up to this point, right, Pharaoh has allowed his people to suffer humiliation, financial loss, and diseases on both man and beast. And he's still, there's a mixture of him hardening his heart and God hardening his heart. He still doesn't let him go. And these first 9 plagues follow a logical progression where God used and intensified natural events and delivered them at the time of his choosing, right? But this 10th plague is in a different realm altogether. There's no natural explanation for it at all. And in the final plague, Pharaoh will indeed come to understand that the God of the Hebrews is really the God over all the earth. In the New Bible Dictionary, page 934, Wood states, so far God has demonstrated his full control over the natural creation. He had caused his servant Moses to announce the successive plagues and brought them to pass in invincible sequence and growing severity when the Pharaoh ever more persistently refused to acknowledge Israel's God in the face of the clearest credentials of his authority and power. So in this final plague came the most explicit sign of God's precise and full control, the death of the firstborn only. Nor did it come without adequate warning, from Exodus 4:23. The Pharaoh had every opportunity to acknowledge God and obey his behest, and so to take the consequences of refusal. And so had to take the consequences of refusal. So this 10th plague can be found in Exodus 11 and 12. In Exodus 11, 1 through 10, it says, Yehovah said to Moses, "Yet one plague more I will bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will drive you away completely. Speak now in the hearing of the people, that they ask every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor for silver and gold jewelry." And Yehovah gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. So Moses said, "Thus says Yehovah, about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of cattle. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor ever will be again. But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that Yehovah makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." So here again, God makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. And we are living in modern Egypt, right? This society that we live in is equated to Egypt with its idolatry, false religion, and everything else. It's aberrant behavior. Verse 8, "And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, 'Get out, you and all of the people who follow you.' After that I will go out." And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. Then Yehovah said to Moses, "Pharaoh will not listen to you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt." Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and Yehovah hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go out of his land. You know, you've got God intervening in this situation to prove his point. Yehovah said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this is Exodus 12, verse 1, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat, you shall take your count of the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is Yehovah's Passover." Continuing on in verse 12, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yehovah. right? So again, he's executing judgments on the gods of Egypt, defining himself and demonstrating himself to be the one true God, the only God. Verse 13, the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to Yehovah throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast, and that's what we're doing here. Verse 15, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the seventh day a holy assembly. And that's what we're doing here on this seventh day. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your host out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a sojourner or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwelling places you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until the morning. For Yehovah will pass through and strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel on the 2 doorposts, Yehovah will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and for your sons forever. And when you come to the land that Yehovah will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? You shall say, it is the sacrifice of Yehovah's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt, when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the people of Israel went and did so, as Yehovah had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. At midnight, Yehovah struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Now, the firstborn child was in the ancient Near East, was not only an heir of a double portion of his father's inheritance, but also represented special qualities of life, right? And you can see that in Genesis 49. The law of primogeniture decreed that the major portion of a family estate would be inherited by the firstborn son when the father died. And the death of the firstborn son would cripple a family legally and emotionally. So this was a big deal. This 10th plague was potentially more devastating than any of the other plagues put together, both economically and emotionally, because you're starting to interrupt the inheritance process, right? And obviously this plague was far too direct and selective to be any kind of natural phenomenon. There's no disease that I'm aware of that affects the firstborn only. And it destroyed only the Egyptian firstborn, whether human or animal, while the Israelites were exempt, right? Because of the blood. They were set aside and protected by the blood, just as we are. Christ's sacrifice sets us aside and protects us. When we enter into that covenant with him through baptism with our Father. And this plague kind of reminds us how the Egyptians, have murdered the baby boys, the Hebrew boys, to prevent their nation from growing, right? And that's why Moses was set aside in the first place. And that phrase, against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue, suggests that all would be calm in Goshen that night. All right, so there was no disturbance in the land of Goshen where the Israelites were. In the ESV Study Bible by Dennis and Grudem, they state, since the Lord had shown clearly in previous plagues that he could distinguish between the people of Egypt and Israel, the blood placed on the doorway of the houses of Israel was to function both as a sign that they were a part of the Lord's people and also as the seal or means to appropriate the Lord's protection from the plague. Right? So if they didn't have the blood there, they would have lost their firstborn. So even Pharaoh's house was affected. And several months before, Moses had warned Pharaoh that his firstborn child and heir to the throne would die if he refused to listen to God, back in Exodus 4:22 and 23. He didn't listen. And this plague also suggests that Ramses II was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus, since he was the firstborn son of Seti the first. In the Monuments of Seti the First, page 315, Brand says the titles ascribed to the young Ramses are consistent with the station of a crown prince, i.e. king's eldest son and hereditary prince. So this plague marked the beginning of the Passover. The blood of the lamb would signify that they had obeyed the commands of God. The unleavened bread would remind them that they were sent out quickly. The bitter herbs would symbolize the bitterness of their bondage in Egypt. And in the years to come, every time they celebrated the Passover, they'd recall their former position as slaves and be reminded that God had redeemed them. He had saved them. In the work Exodus, Stewart says on page 273, here we read that God has decided that history determines the calendar, and in particular, the history of God's saving act of the Exodus does so. Whatever might theoretically have been their previous thinking about a calendar, God decreed to his old covenant people that they would henceforth have a calendar designed to remind them of how they first became a people. It happened by reason of their deliverance by his mighty hand out of the bondage of the oppressor, an act so important that it was also to be memorialized by a special annual feast, the Passover. With every Passover celebration, right, they looked forward to the Messiah, the one that would really deliver them from the bondage of sin. These parallels aren't by accident, bondage in Egypt. So this final plague was really an affront to all the gods of Egypt, right? And that's what God told us in Exodus 12:12. And the death of all the firstborn showed them basically that there was no ability in the gods of Egypt to protect them. As most of us know, Pharaoh himself was actually considered a god among his people. And in the IVP Bible background commentary on the Old Testament, it says, in Egypt, Pharaoh was also considered a deity, and this last plague is directed at him. In the 9th plague, his father, the sun god, was defeated, and now his son, presumably the heir to the throne, will be slaughtered. This is a blow to Pharaoh's person, his kingship, and his divinity. Right? And then in Exodus 12:30, it says, "And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, and there was not a house where someone was not dead." And God's people had cried out to him from Exodus 3:7 and 9 for deliverance, and he heard them. Now the Egyptians would cry out to Pharaoh, and he would be unable to do anything. He can't help them. So where were all of these gods? Where was Osiris, the judge of the dead and patron deity of Pharaoh? Where was Meshchenet, the goddess who presided at the birth of children? She wasn't only supposed to ensure the safe delivery of a child, but help decide their destiny at birth. Did she determine that all the firstborn children among the Egyptians should die, but spare the Hebrew children? Well, we all know the answer to that. In his work, Egyptian Medicine in the Days of Pharaohs, Ebed, on pages 165 and 166, says Goddess Meshchenet presided over the birth process. Her symbol was the bicornuate uterus of a cow, and she was depicted as a woman wearing this uterus upon her head. Goddess Meshchenet was the personification of the birth bricks upon which women squatted when giving birth. Meshchenet became a goddess of destiny, and at the time of birth, thought would inscribe the number of years that the infant would live upon the birth brick. It was thought who fixes the span of life, keeps account of the years, and orders every man's fate on his stone. Where was Hathor, one of the 7 deities who attended the birth of children? She was linked to the female sexuality as well as with motherhood. Hathor was a cow goddess and symbolically the mother of Pharaoh. It's very significant that the firstborn of all cattle would die also, right? Since she was a cow goddess. Min, the god of procreation. Isis, the goddess of fertility. None of them. No answer. Again, in Ebed's work, Egyptian Medicine and Days of Pharaoh, on page 370, he says, her magic power extended to the care of children as well as her talent in being a magician and physician whose counsel is the breath of life, whose sayings drive out sickness, and whose word gives life to him whose breath is failing. In Bible Knowledge Commentary, Hannah states, the goddess Isis, the wife and sister of Osiris, supposedly protected children, but this plague showed her to be totally incompetent to do what the Egyptians trusted her for. Then there's Bes, the dwarf god. The ancient Egyptians pictured the god Bes as a form of a dwarf wearing the skin of a lion. And the Egyptians would often decorate their headrests, footboards, and mirrors with these images of Bes. In his work, Ancient Egyptian Gods and Goddesses, Hart says he is a bandy-legged dwarf with some of the features of a lion. He often wears a panther skin and holds a weapon to show he is ready to defend a woman and her newly born children. He also says on page 58 and 59, he has his most critical contribution to make to Egyptian life in his role as protector of childbirth in partnership with Taweret. So none of these gods were able to do a thing. Serket, the scorpion goddess and guardian of life, she was the symbol of motherhood in the ancient Near East and was supposedly had a protective role around the throne of Pharaoh. In the Book of the Dead, she's a protector of the deceased. Renenutet, the cobra goddess, and also a guardian of Pharaoh, She was supposed to be the living embodiment of motherhood, and she's often represented as a woman nursing a child. In fact, the name suggests the idea of nursing or raising a child. In Hussein's The Gods and Goddesses of Ancient Egypt on page 120, he says her name means mammy. She was the goddess who takes care of the child at his birth and protect him. She was also the goddess of the good fate of people. And Wilkinson, in his Complete Gods and Goddesses of Ancient Egypt on page 225, says Renenutet was also identified with the household and family life in her role as provider, nourisher, and as a nurse of infants. There was Teweret, the hippopotamus goddess and protectress of women in childbirth, one of the most popular Egyptian deities. Wilkinson says in his work, the goddess is one of the earliest recognizable apotropaic deities, and she is widely represented on amulets from Old Kingdom times onward. She was represented on beds, headrests, and other small items of furniture, as well as on cosmetic items such as unguent pots and spoons, and on various items with fertility significance, such as the so-called paddle dolls, faience vases similar to small jars in human form which were made to hold mother's milk. They were made in the shape of the goddess with pouring holes to wear it at the nipples, probably to hold milk for magical use. And then in Ramban's commentary on the Torah, on page 118 and 119, he says the reason for this commandment is that the constellation of Aries, the Ram, is at the height of its power in the month of Nisan, it being the sign of the zodiac which ascends the heavens. Therefore, he commanded us to slaughter the sheep and to eat it in order to inform us that it was not by the power of that constellation that we went out from Egypt, but by decree of the Supreme One, and according to the opinion of our rabbis, that the Egyptians worshipped it as a deity. He has all the more informed us through this that he subdued their gods and their powers at the height of their ascendancy. And then Hirth in Archaeology and the Old Testament on page 164 says the final plague has no natural explanation, but it too was directed against a god, the next king, the god to be. Even if natural phenomena were operative in the first 9 plagues, this does not detract from their miraculous nature. Their timing and selectivity requires that they, as well as the final plague, be seen as acts of God. The Pharaoh vacillated whether he should allow Moses and his people to leave. When the Pharaoh's eldest son died in the last plague, the king relented long enough for the trek out of Egypt to begin, thus bringing the Egyptian sojourn to a close. So the story of the plagues is summarized in Psalm 78, 44 through 51, and Psalm 105, 28 through 36, but it's not really in chronological order. In Psalm 135, 8 and 136, 10, we see the death of the firstborn, and it's the only plague mentioned at all, probably because that particular plague made a greater impression on the future generations. This 10th plague, therefore, can stand for all of the plagues, right? Because it was the most memorable. You can take a look at Hebrews 11:28. And after these plagues, Pharaoh released the children of Israel. The descendants of Abraham had arrived in Egypt, being in number about 70, and now they're leaving with more than 600,000 men, not counting women and children. So there's probably over 1 million people, maybe more. So it seems that man only recognizes the supremacy of his creator when he demonstrates it in powerful ways. Right? Ezekiel 7:9 says, "And my eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. I will punish you according to your ways, while your abominations are in your midst. Then you will know that I am Yehovah who strikes. And Ezekiel 36:11, and I will multiply on you man and beast, and they shall multiply and be fruitful. And I will cause you to be inhabited as in your former times, and will do more good to you than ever before. Then you will know that I am Yehovah. Right? So the time is coming when Yehovah will demonstrate again his power and supremacy. Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 through 13. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. We are being measured now. This measuring of the temple is happening now. Judge not yourselves, and you won't be judged, as James mentioned. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out. For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city 42 months. And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, this is how he is doomed to be killed. They have the power to shut the sky, that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying, and they have power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague, as often as they desire. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified, right? This is a specific reference to Jerusalem. For 3.5 days, some of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. Sound like Pharaoh. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents, because these 2 prophets had been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. And it's quite possible that they're going to think that they've done something good. They're going to think that these people were evil, that these 2 witnesses were evil and were bringing, bad things on the earth as a result. Verse 11, but after the 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. And at that hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. So we see that man has to be brought to his lowest point, and it has to be struck with great fear in order to repent. But we don't need to fear what man can do to us. We have to fear Yehovah, the all-powerful creator and sustainer of the universe. And we will recognize him as the God, the creator and sustainer of the universe. Everyone will at some point. But wouldn't it be great if we could do that without the need for terrifying plagues and miracles? So, brethren, as it says in Acts 3:19 through 21, repent therefore and turn back, that your sins may be blotted out, that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, and that he may send the Christ appointed for you, Jesus, whom heaven must receive until the time of restoring all things, about which God spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets long ago. Amen to that. So that concludes our study for this morning. So with that, we will wrap up our formal service. If you will please take up your hymnals and open them up to page 103. On page 103, we'll sing our final hymn, which comes from Psalm 137, titled By the Waters of Babylon, after which I'd like to call upon Jerry Shaleski to please close in prayer. But first, page 103, By the Waters of Babylon. Okay, if you'll please remain standing for the closing prayer, we'll now turn the mic over to Jerry for closing prayer. Jerry? Your mic's not working, Jerry. Well, all right. Wes, would you like to close in prayer? Jerry seems to be having difficulty again.
Sure shot.
All right.
Heavenly Father, gracious God, you who lives and reigns supreme above all, we come before you humbly to your throne of grace, O God, and thanking you for all the many blessings you bestow upon us. We thank you for this day. We thank you for what it represents. We thank you for opening our eyes, oh God. Heavenly Father, we hope that you'll continue to have mercy on our work. Help us to bless this work and do the job that you have put before us. We hope and pray, though God, that you'll bless the Sabbath day, the Sabbath meal, and hope and pray, God, you'll help us, oh God, to obey your voice in word, thought, word, and deed. And I ask this all by Jesus Christ's name. Amen.